Welcome back to the deep dive. This time, you've sent in some audio clips from the American History Tellers podcast all about Jamestown. It's one of those stories we all kind of remember from school, but the details, well, they get a little fuzzy over time.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating how often history is presented as this sort of simple, straightforward narrative. But when you dig deeper, well, you find it's full of complexity or contradictions and stories that, they kind of defy our expectations. And Jamestown is just a perfect example of that.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Before we get to those English settlers, our sources paint a picture of Virginia back then. It was called Senecoma. You gotta imagine, like a landscape that's been shaped by indigenous people for like over 10,000 years.
Wow.
Lush forests, rivers just teeming with fish. A society with its own complex social structures, spiritual beliefs. This was the world of Chief Powhatan. A leader whose influence, I mean, it extended way beyond what we might even imagine.
Yeah. And it's so important to remember that this wasn't just some empty wilderness just waiting to be discovered. It was a vibrant, dynamic world. And the arrival of, what was it, 104 Englishmen in 1607, I mean, that would just disrupt that world in ways that neither side could have ever anticipated.
That's such a good point. And our sources tell us that these Englishmen were driven by like this potent mix of ambition and desperation, lured by the promise of riches, gold, silver, pearls. But many were also, they were fleeing really difficult circumstances back home, seeking a fresh start,
Yeah.
or maybe even escaping their past.
Yeah, and that mix of motivations, it really created a volatile environment right from the get-go. We see this in the story of John Smith, this seasoned soldier who was almost hanged for mutiny before they even set foot in Virginia. I mean, it really speaks volumes about the internal tensions and power struggles that just plagued the early colony.
Wow, talk about a rocky start. So they finally land on this swampy peninsula 50 miles up the James River and establish Jamestown. I'm guessing it wasn't quite the paradise they were hoping for.
Not exactly. I mean, from day one, they faced just incredible challenges. Disease, hunger, conflict with the local tribes. This became their daily reality. And you have to remember, these weren't like seasoned frontiersmen. Many were gentlemen, totally unaccustomed to manual labor, completely unprepared for just the harsh realities of life in this new world.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if they even grasped, like the magnitude of what they were getting into. One of the sources mentions the English planting crosses, claiming the land for King James. I mean, that seems like a pretty significant gesture. But what did it mean for the indigenous people who already called this land home?
It's such a good point. This act, seemingly so simple, it really reveals a profound cultural disconnect. For the English, planting a cross, it was a symbolic act of possession, a declaration of their right to rule. But for the native people, it meant intrusion, a complete disregard for their existing systems of governance and land stewardship.
Right, and that disconnect would have such far-reaching consequences, wouldn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
our sources describe Jamestown as this place where leadership just crumbled. Accusations flew, trust was like a rare commodity. It sounds like this pressure cooker of paranoia and desperation.
Oh yeah. And this is where the story of John Smith's captivity, it becomes just so fascinating. Captured by Powhatan's brother, he undergoes this mock execution and then a symbolic adoption ceremony. It's a moment that forces us to consider how differently these two cultures viewed, power, ritual, even the very act of incorporation.
It seems like Smith, even in captivity, was this master of navigating just complex situations. He viewed his adoption as like a strategic advantage, but for Powhatan, it was likely a calculated move to assert his dominance, right? And maybe potentially control this unpredictable new element within his domain.
Exactly. It raises all these questions about Smith's true motivations. Was he genuinely interested in peaceful coexistence, or was he just, a pragmatist, willing to do whatever it took to survive, to advance his own position? It's a debate that historians still grapple with today.
And speaking of grappling, Smith's return to Jamestown, it's anything but a hero's welcome, right? I mean, he escapes captivity, makes it back to the colony, only to be promptly sentenced to hang himself.
I know, right? It's just shocking. Just underscores the volatility of life in early Jamestown. They were on the brink of collapse, plagued by internal conflict, external threats. Suspicion and fear were just everywhere, even directed at those who had previously been seen as leaders. It really highlights just how precarious their whole situation was. Imagine like the turmoil within the colony, the sense of betrayal, the desperation. But just as things seemed completely hopeless, well, a ship
Oh,
arrives.
talk about a dramatic entrance. This has got to be Captain Newport returning from England, right?
Exactly. Newport's arrival, it was a lifeline for that struggling colony. He brought much needed supplies and news from London. It temporarily kind of eased the tension and remember that ore sample Newport had sent back.
Oh, yeah, the supposed gold. Whatever happened with that?
Well, let's just say the excitement was pretty short-lived. Turned out that ore, it wasn't gold at all, practically worthless,
Uh,
actually. And this was a major blow to the Virginia Company. They had invested so much in the colony's success.
yeah, I bet that didn't go over well with the investors back in England. Weren't they expecting, a return on their investment?
Of course. The Virginia Company, they were under immense pressure to deliver. They had promised investors, a share of the riches and a failing colony. Well, that didn't exactly inspire confidence, so they had to get creative.
So what do they do? Do they just like abandon the colony?
Not quite. What they did was they launched this massive PR campaign, spinning these tales of boundless opportunity in Virginia. They published pamphlets, filled with these glowing accounts of the colony's potential, downplaying the hardships, emphasizing the allure of adventure and prosperity.
Ah, so it sounds like a classic case of putting a positive spin on things. Did they actually manage to convince anyone to go to Jamestown after all that?
It's surprising, but yeah, they did. They tapped into those anxieties of a rapidly growing population back in England, many of whom were facing, economic hardship, limited prospects, and that promise of a fresh start in this land of opportunity, however exaggerated, well, it proved irresistible to many.
So instead of adventurers seeking quick riches, this new wave of colonists, it included families, women, children. I mean, this marks a pretty significant shift, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The arrival of women and children, well, it transformed Jamestown from just a temporary outpost into a fledgling community,
Right.
one that aspired to permanence. And it also added a whole new dimension to the relationship with the Powhatan.
Because now it wasn't just about trade or territorial disputes, right? It was about establishing roots, building a future,
Yeah.
and figuring out how to coexist in a land where they were still very much outsiders.
Exactly. And that coexistence, well, it was far from harmonious. As the colony grew, tensions with the Powhatan escalated. There were skirmishes, raids, and just this growing sense of mistrust on both sides. That cultural divide, coupled with the pressure for resources and land, it made peaceful coexistence increasingly difficult.
In the midst of all this, John Smith reemerges, as a key figure. He was elected president of the council and essentially became the colony's leader. He imposed discipline, organized work parties, and tried to navigate that complex relationship with the Powhatan, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through force.
He was a pragmatist. He did what he thought was necessary to ensure the colony's survival, even if it meant, resorting to some pretty harsh measures. He understood the importance of forging alliances with local tribes. He recognized that the colony's fate was intertwined with the Powhatan Confederacy.
But even with their best efforts, the colonists continued to face just immense challenges. Our sources, they describe these ongoing struggles with disease, drought, and conflict with the Powhatan. It seems like this never-ending cycle of hardship.
But it's a brutal existence. And survival, well, it was never guaranteed. Yet, amidst all that hardship, there are these glimpses of resilience, ingenuity, and even hope. The colonists learned to adapt to their environment. They developed new farming techniques, and they gradually established a foothold in this unfamiliar land.
But it sounds like that foothold, it came at a cost. The relationship with the Powhatan, it remained, fraught with tension. And as the colony expanded, well, it inevitably encroached further into the territory of the surrounding tribes. I mean, this dynamic would have some pretty long-lasting consequences, wouldn't it?
Yes, and it brings us to a really pivotal moment in Jamestown's story. In the fall of 1609, John Smith, he's injured in a gunpowder explosion. He's forced to return to England. And this event, it created a leadership vacuum that would have devastating consequences for the colony.
This seems like a real turning point. So what happened after Smith left? Did the colony manage to hold on?
Unfortunately, without Smith's leadership, Jamestown it spiraled into chaos. Food supplies dwindled, disease was rampant, and that already strained relationship with the Powhatan, well, it just completely deteriorated. This period, it's known as the Starving Time, and it was one of the darkest chapters in Jamestown's history.
It's hard to imagine, the desperation, the suffering they must have endured during that starving time. It seems like Smith's leadership, for all its flaws, was kind of crucial to the colony's survival at least up to that point.
Oh, absolutely. The starving time, it really exposes how fragile the colony was. It underscores how dependent they were on strong leadership and this tenuous peace with the Powhatan Confederacy. It's a stark reminder of just the harsh realities of life on the frontier, that constant struggle for survival.
So after the starving time, what happened? Did Jamestown recover?
Well, the colony, it did eventually recover, but it was a long and arduous process. New leadership arrived, new supplies were sent from England, and eventually they established a more stable foothold. But that relationship with the Powhatan, it remained strained, and conflict, it continued to erupt periodically.
It's a reminder that even when you're faced with just immense hardship, the human spirit can find a way to endure. But it's also clear that Jamestown's survival, it came at a significant cost. The impact on the indigenous population, it was devastating.
Yeah, the arrival of the English in Jamestown and the subsequent expansion of the colony, it had a profound and lasting impact on the native people of the region. It led to displacement, disease, and the erosion of their traditional ways of life. It's
Yep.
a legacy that continues to be felt even today.
This deep dive it's been a fascinating journey through this pivotal moment in American history.
Yeah.
It's one of those stories that we might think we know, but when you really delve into the details, it reveals so much complexity, so much nuance.
Absolutely. Jamestown's story, it's filled with ambition, hardship, resilience, and tragedy. It's a story that forces us to confront the complexities of colonization and the lasting impact it had on both the colonizers and the indigenous people.
So to answer our initial question, was Jamestown a success or a failure? I don't think there's a simple answer. It depends on how we define success and whose perspective we're considering.
Right. On the one hand, it represents the first permanent English settlement in North America,
Hmm.
a foothold that would eventually lead to the formation of the United States. But on the other hand, it came at a tremendous cost, both in terms of human suffering and the displacement and exploitation of indigenous populations.
It's a story that challenges us to look beyond simple narratives and grapple with the messy, often uncomfortable truths of history. It's a reminder that the past, it's never truly past. It continues to shape our present and influence our future.
And it's a reminder that there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more stories to uncover. History, it's not just a static collection of facts. It's a dynamic and ever-evolving conversation.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did. If you enjoyed this exploration of Jamestown, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more fascinating journeys into the past. We'll be back soon with another intriguing topic and a fresh set of sources to explore together.